Hello, everybody. Matt Orfalea here. I'm here with James D'Angelo, and he's got an interesting story. He quit his smarty pants job at NASA to try and save us all from money and politics here on Earth. And he has a real solution for money and politics that no one else is talking about. He's been on Empire Files with Abby Martin, and just recently he's had his work published in Foreign Affairs. James, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Cool. So before we get into this really mind-blowingly simple, real solution to money and politics, as you know, I recently made a series of videos on the influence of AIPAC on Congress and, you know, the influence they have on money in Congress. And the feedback I got from that seems a lot of people have this notion that money in politics is primarily functions as bribery. But as you explain really well, it's much more than that. So can you go ahead and explain that?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. You have books, Corruption in America by Zephyr Teachout, which is one of the leading recent books that's come out on corruption. Larry Lessig's written a book basically on corruption. And if you go through these books, I got them as ebooks. And if you go through them, you can find bribery-related instances hundreds of times. And you can't find any instances of intimidation. We think that corruption is produced almost by the exact opposite of that ratio. So bribery is something that people have worked really hard trying to show. And it's happened in history. But the instances of it are very, very rare. So when Larry Lessig started this group at Harvard, he hired this guy named Clayton Peoples to basically try and show that bribery is happening in Congress. And boy, man, they didn't get very far. So it's looking at it statistically, using meta-analysis, outside of the handful of cases of bribery that have actually been indicted, they found almost nothing. And if we think about it, there's even kind of a logical sense to it, which is, say I'm one of these big interest groups, and you mentioned AIPAC, but they all play by the same playbook, which is we don't have an infinite amount of money. We want to make our money go as far as possible. What are we going to use, bribery or intimidation? Well, intimidation makes a lot more sense for a number of reasons. First of all, if I try and bribe you, that's an interaction that you can record and show. So it gives you a lot of power, right? If you're speaking out against me, first of all, we don't see really any examples of the NRA coming to someone who's going against the NRA and the NRA going, hey, we're going to give you $10,000 if you change your vote. So it's just no examples of that. And think of the power that the representative would have if he was able to, or he or she was able to record that conversation, right? They'd be the next president if they could show that sort of a direct interaction. So we don't even see the attempted bribery. What usually happens, and this is how money works, it works basically the same throughout, is instead of bribery, we call it brubery, which is you are working against me. You want to propose something against me. We take all of our money and we give it to that guy over there. Who's that guy over there? Well, they're running against you. Do we ask them to change their votes? No, we don't even care how they change, what they do with their votes. They're just not you. Then we take whatever extra money we have, which might even be half, might even be 90%, and we run negative ads against you. So if you talk to anyone at Open Secrets, they talk a lot about dark money. Then you talk to them about dark money, and they'll say 95% of that money is used as negative advertisement. And almost all of it is based on individual votes of members. And so that money obviously isn't going to you. It's not going to any member of Congress. It's going to the networks or advertising or billboards. So whoever's producing that stuff benefits. The money is never given to members of Congress. So the amount that members receive from the NRA, we find, is usually brubery. It's money given to someone that's not the other person. And so they're not expected to change their votes. It's nice if they're aligned. So statistically, bribery is not there. Intimidation, you don't have to look too far to see examples of intimidation.
Although it because it occurs without any money being transferred necessarily, that's why, it is hard to see in that sense.
Very hard to measure on the individual level.
Yes.
Very easy to look at and see sort of on the looking at sort of broad scope issues, right? You get negative ads all the time, even during the Super Bowl, right? And they'll even say sponsored by the NRA. Now, how much does that influence the individual they're going after? You can't measure that, right? You don't have the direct one-to-one. But what's really amazing about intimidation is if I go after you and I take you out of office, that has an effect on every other legislator on earth. And so it's really key as part of, say, the NRA or these other groups, is to make it very clear that they've taken members out. So they really are very proud when they've taken a member out, and they'll even advertise based on that. This person got knocked out. They're not trying to hide their influence on that. That's very important to them. So that's very Machiavelli. Yes.
And let me, I'll read a quote, just going on the theme of AIPAC, since that's a recent, subject that's gotten some attention lately. And you sent me this good quote from Representative Paul Findley, who said, "The intimidation factor is alive and well on Capitol Hill, where most members, while privately resenting the pressure, dutifully toe the Israeli line." And he says his solution is, if voting were kept secret, I'm confident that aid to Israel will have long ago been heavily conditioned, if not terminated, in both chambers. So basically, he's saying, if we if we could make the vote secret for congressmen, like it is for regular citizens, they wouldn't have to toe to that pressure from special interest. Now you stumble. This has become a major focus of your research at the Congressional Research Institute. How did you find this? Because this is not a solution that people are talking about. How did you stumble upon this stuff?
There was no moment of afflatus. There wasn't a single moment where it all came together. It's something I've had some instincts about this for going on 20 years. When a friend of mine was writing a screenplay based on The West Wing, and he was watching all this C-SPAN stuff, and I was a complete yahoo when it came to government, and he was the friend that always wins every trivia game whenever we go out, right? He just knows everything. And he was writing this very thoughtful screenplay about government, which I knew very little about. And he was watching this clip of members voting openly in Congress. And it just, I wish I could say I had any sort of genius about it. I just got scared. It's like, if I was in their shoes, I would be intimidated. I'd be scared of my son telling me how to vote, right? I'd be scared certainly of more powerful groups. I would be scared of the other members, right? I'm trying to make friends with them. They propose a bill. I don't like it. I'm going to be in trouble, right? And so I just got this chill. I actually got goosebumps when I saw that. And so I mentioned it to him, and he tore me a new asshole, right? He knows everything about government. And so I basically shut up and was like, okay, I can't even really tell you the difference between the House and the Senate. And here's this guy who knows everything. So that was about 20 years ago. And then, you just bump into weird things continuously thereafter. And each time I would go, God, it still bothers me. And I was reading Fareed Zakaria's phenomenal book called The Future of Freedom. And in that book, he questions transparency. So this is one of the few books that I've ever run into that has this. He is basically, and they all tuck it. So we find that scholars tuck their questions of transparency late because there's so much backlash, right? So he's got it in chapter 6, page 172, where he says, and this blew my mind. He's like, well, that they used to vote secretly, but sometime in the early 1970s, they switched. And again, I got the same chill. I'm just like, what are you? I'd never heard that. Yeah, I'm this idiot about government, but you would think that I would know that they switched, right? And I'm like, what? So they went all the way through history, and then they switched in 1970s. And so I kind of, again, beat up by the guy. I just kind of put it to bed. Then my son's born in 2011, and I start getting nervous about climate change. I start getting nervous about all these groups, money in Congress, all that. So I decide for the first time to sort of take this by its horns. And I download this data set from Duke, which is all congressional voting throughout history. It's a beautiful data set. And at the same time, I'm downloading books like crazy, and I'm ADD, so I'm doing each first chapter as I'm running around the reservoir. And I keep hearing in the first chapter, and it didn't matter whose book, be it from the right or the left, well, everything was going great until the early 1970s. So if you're on the right, you're very concerned about debt. You're concerned about the ability to shut down programs. You're concerned about the deficit. You're concerned about flexibility of government, right? And the ability to control the expenditures of government. If you're on the left, you're worried about inequality. You're worried about climate. You're worried about all these other things. But they all would say in the first chapter, something happened in the 1970s. And here I've got this data set that I'm looking at from Duke, and there's this huge elbow in the early 1970s. And again, I get that same sort of chilling feeling. I'm like, what's going on here? And only then I remember that Fareed had mentioned something about the early 70s. And so I decided to start to dig up that bill, just figure out what changed, right? Yeah, I didn't know it was a bill. I didn't know if it was a rules change. Really didn't know anything. I spent weeks trying to find this.
Trying to find what happened in 1970 that started this inequality,
Trying to find what changed the voting.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So we now know it's called the Legislative Reorganization Act of 1970. Mm-hmm. You couldn't imagine something more ignored by political scientists than this bill.
Yeah, I had never heard of it.
Which is the law, right? And what's crazy about this is, think of the name. Legislative is Congress. Reorganize is change. Act means it got switched into law. And it's a massive change. It's only one of two legislative reorganization acts in history, the other in 1946, and well studied. If we think about the time period, so 1970, it gets signed into law by Nixon October 26, 1970, gets instituted January 3rd, 1971. This time period's a funky period for imagining or thinking of Congress. First of all, political science in the United States is a baby at the time. You don't really have political scientists in the 1930s or 1940s. It's a new field. And some of the stars of this field are doing most of their work in the late 60s. So you've got people like John Kingdon. I'm going to forget the name, a couple of the other ones. So they're doing their big PhD work in the late 60s. And then they end up publishing in the mid 70s because it takes a while to put your book together. In the middle, though, they had this huge change, which messes with all their data, right? We're now going to change how Congress works. So they could either choose to acknowledge that, write a chapter about it, or choose to ignore it. Well, sadly, they chose to ignore it. And these become the books that all congressional scholars have on their shelves, right? So Kingdon's book is just as big and famous as possible, right? You don't get bigger than that. The other guy whose name, David Mayhew, right? So these are the biggest books of political science. These are the foundings of political scientists. And they basically all did their work right up to 1969, then published in the mid 70s and get on everybody's bookshelf. And so people just overlook this change, which Kingdon finally acknowledges in 1989. And he only does so very minorly. In the preface of his book, he goes, well, yeah, there was this kind of big change. They opened up all the votes of all the legislators, and he talks constantly about how lobbyists, if you know the vote, that changes your ability to lobby, right? That's in his previous book, right? And he goes, yeah, when they open the votes, members seem to get more pressure and members seem to be more nervous. And hell yeah, they were, right? And so he acknowledges it in 1989. I don't think he acknowledges far enough. Mayhew, I believe, is still alive. He has not acknowledged it. But they cheated. They really did. They knew that this big change had come, and they ignored it. And so these books become the seminal research for political science. And if you look at the dates, you just kind of trust them, right? So yeah, there's an issue there. I don't know. I don't really remember your question. I kind of get off on tangents sometimes, so you can always smack me around if I.
Yeah, well, just about this. How you stumbled upon this. This idea of solving the money problem in Congress with just a simple solution. Now, I'd like to share how I discovered you in this idea. Okay. So it was a video you made years ago, which you just called the cardboard box solution. That's the solution. Votes are secret if you just put them in a cardboard box. Super simple. We do it as private citizens. If Congress does it, they will no longer be intimidated by special interests. Now, and you made a really compelling introduction and case for this when you explained. You shared all these graphs that we're all so familiar with, thanks to Bernie Sanders and Robert Reich and all these people who are talking
even
about.
The people on the right are very concerned about these things. There's no one on the right who doesn't find, I would say, any of those graphs disturbing.
Yeah, even Tucker Carlson has been, talking regularly about this growing inequality.
Mainstream right, even they're very concerned about it. Inequality. Doesn't make anybody happy. The rising debt and deficit does not make anyone happy. And incarceration, by the way, is an issue very pursued by the people on the right to try and get under control. Right? Think of it as a massive
growing incarceration too. Yeah, just all these slopes, just like of things getting increasingly worse. Everybody talks about this growing inequality, this problem is getting worse, but they don't talk about where, like, why it started. Why did it start in the 1970s? And you have this theory that it's a significant part is due to this change in voting legislation, the way Congress votes. Right.
I think it's important to think about the other offerings that people put out there. Who's the really famous scholar at MIT? He's kind of the
Chomsky?
Chomsky. So Chomsky speaks about this time period. And if you think about it, I can't imagine him being on any worse footing than when he talks about this change. So he's trying to figure out why this change happens. And he basically says that people got greedy. So people are suddenly more greedy. Right? Corporations become suddenly more greedy. They don't care about anyone anymore. I'm like, man, go ahead.
He does specifically point to the Powell memo. That Right. So not so much that they all of a sudden got greedy, but they all of a sudden, started organizing their power to exercise, to get legislation passed to favor business.
Right. But that fits under my rubric of greedy. He paints a picture of greed, and then he goes into the Powell memo. The Powell memo is actually really, really interesting and poorly read by people. I've got some quotes on that I'll give you in a second. The Powell memo, for people who are not familiar, is this memo by a future Supreme Court justice. He becomes Supreme Court justice in 1972 under Nixon. Before that, he's basically a corporate lobbyist for big tobacco. He's a lawyer. He's a corporate lobbyist at a time when lobbying as a corporation is almost impossible. And so he's griping about that. That's a big issue to him. And so while Chomsky focuses on a couple of the quotes there, I think the most important quote is, and I'm going to paraphrase pretty badly, but I think I'll get the gist right. He's basically saying this is Powell talking, the last thing you want to do on earth is become a lobbyist for big business. They don't listen to you at all. The only things they care about are consumers and the environment. Think about this as a complaint from corporate lobbying when there is no K Street, when lobbyists are indeed in the lobby, right? And this is what changes. So lobbyists are now allowed in the lobby. So everyone's giving credit to this memo. And I think it's very important to think about the Powell memo and sort of the reference with Koch brothers and really big money, right? You have the Koch brothers becoming very successful lobbyists since this time. But you need to recall that you can read the book. I believe it's Dark Money. What's the woman who wrote that fantastic book?
I saw the PBS movie. I don't know if it's a documentary on Dark Money.
No. This is totally separate.
Okay.
Big book by this woman author, really phenomenally well written. What she does is she basically looks at the before 1970, everyone's trying to do the same thing. So the Powell memo did not motivate people to act differently. The father of the Koch brothers, who is also mega wealthy, is doing all the same things that his children are doing. And he's inspiring them to do that. So he's funding Barry Goldwater. He's writing libertarian pamphlets. He's trying to publish. He's organizing all the rich people on earth, right? The only problem is they're getting nothing done. They are failing. So people look at this, everyone's trying to find a correlation. Okay, something that happened in 1970s that we can correlate because we've got nothing, right? and they find this memo. You don't have to go back too far to find similar memos. The DuPonts were writing and doing similar things in the late 30s, right? There's all sorts of calls throughout history. So I think it's unfair journalism, and Hacker and Pearson also love this memo, right? But they don't talk about that. This was just part of a continuum.
Yes. People. Yeah, exactly. I mean, businesses have always wanted to maximize profits, and they've always been willing to, put these strings in. Yes, to do what. Yeah,
always right.
To cheat, do whatever.
It's mind blowing. I mean, I would be acting the exact same way. I don't blame billionaires for being greedy. I don't blame people are greedy, right? If I can get away with stuff on my taxes, I'm going to do it. That's just how people are, and that's why we need government to control some of that, right? So I think it's really important to look at that moment of the Powell memo more as a great piece of history, because he's saying it's impossible to lobby government. And other scholars who look at lobbying say the same thing, how ineffectual it was, right? Lobbyists wore cheap shoes, had cheap suits, worked out of their kitchens. I'm not making this up. This is what they were doing. And there were very few of them. Right. And most of them were looking for another job. Yeah. Right. So,
yeah. I was just going to say, you look at that Lincoln movie, those lobbyists aren't doing so well. but to be fair, neither is Lincoln. Those are older times. But
right. Right. And again, I'm going to make one caveat here. Let's not conflate executive branch with legislative branch. So the transparency that I talk about, a lot of people just go, "Oh, you're pro-transparency. You're against transparency and all forms of transparency." I'm like, no, we study one specific type of transparency, and that's legislative transparency. Executive branch transparency has been looked at very well by David Posen at NYU. He's written some very provocative stuff on it. I think in many ways he comes up with similar conclusions to ours, but that is not something that we argue back and forth on. So lobbying of executive branch and money in executive branch elections has been around forever. So Teddy Roosevelt talked about that as being a big problem in the early 1900s. Lobbying and money in Congress has not, right? So it's very important to see the difference there. Executive branch is always transparent. How can you veto a bill without it being transparent? How can you sign a bill without it being transparent? Those things will always be open. So I think, especially if we look at the Constitution, which only talks about secrecy for one branch of government, Article 1, the Congress, it advises secrecy just for Congress. It doesn't care about the executive. It's hard to keep the executive secret, right? Let Congress do their work and inspect the executive branch. But I think it's very important. If people take away two things from this interview, I'd say the two things are, there's various types of transparency. So when someone says transparency, definitely think about which type. So if we're talking about campaign finance transparency and whether corporations should have to put their name on a donation, well, I might be for that. I'm not sure. I haven't seen the data, but I'm not against it or for it or either. Executive branch transparency, I don't care. Legislative transparency is a nightmare. Okay. The other thing that people should take away,
because it allows the lobbyists to keep track of how Congress votes, so that effectively enables them to buy votes and to punish them based on votes.
So the buying of votes, again, we don't see a lot of, but we do see a lot of
punish them based. Yeah,
right. Well, they're terrified. Members are terrified, and when you say lobbyists, I think you need to throw in members of your own party. I think you need to keep wives and husbands in. You need to keep foreign national governments. You need to keep the president, the executive branch. All factors of potential intimidation.
Yes.
So I think it's important to switch. If you just switch in your mind that these people, the members of Congress, are not venal, and our data suggests that they're actually probably good people, and they are terrified, and they are getting beaten up. So it's a big reboot for a lot of people, and it was a big reboot for me, who was a pro-transparency advocate who hated everybody in government 6 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I mean, well, personally, I do think transparency in government is generally good, but given that, all these other solutions to money in politics don't really eliminate the money in politics problem. because, they could limit money in politics, but, like if we limited campaign donations, but money in politics would still be very effective. The only way to decrease the effectiveness of money in politics, the corrupting influence of money in politics, is to make it ineffective by making the votes transparent.
Right. And again, we see that in the data. So whenever the votes are made secret, the lobbyists pack up their bags. They go home. Okay. And we have evidence of that. We have great interviews. This is one great interview in New York Times from 1985, because they shut down the committees on taxation. And at the end of the article, the guy who's writing the article for the New York Times going around interviewing various lobbyists who are literally packing their bags. And he's like, what are you doing? Why are you going home? He's like, and this is a big insurance company lobbyist. And he says, what do you want me to do? Stick around here and watch them build my gallows? We're done. They closed the doors.
Do you have any stories of how, like, specific examples of a congressional committee? Actually, since you are proposing specifically, removing some transparency in Congress, why don't you explain the difference, like what actually happens in these congressional committees?
Okay. Yeah. So before 1970, you have a small room where members of Congress meet, and they had been meeting this way since the writing of the Constitution. Again, the Constitution was written in abject secrecy. And as Alexander Hamilton said, because if the deliberations were open, special interests would destroy the process, right? That's what he's saying. So they see this, they understand this, right? Madison says if the deliberations were open, no one would ask questions. No one would look across party lines. He's basically saying you would go in and hold the position that you had made publicly, right? You can't change your mind. You can't ask questions. Why? I wouldn't even be comfortable enough to go, hey, I don't understand that word, or I didn't read the bill. Right. And I know this is a bit of a tangent, but John Elster followed the French Constitution, which was written around the same time. And keep in mind that Thomas Jefferson is there advising the French at the time. So he's not part of the Constitutional Convention. Jefferson is writing to the founders of the framers of the Constitution. Hey, man, I like everything you're doing, but it's a bit too secret for me. Right. So they open the French deliberations of the French Constitution. And John Elster, one of the big political scientists in history, goes through, and he speaks French, reads every line of those deliberations and finds no examples of anyone changing their mind. That's what happens when you go public, right? So from 1789 till 1970, and I'll repeat, all important congressional committees are closed door processes. Right. So the members go inside the small room, oftentimes with their sleeves rolled up. They haven't shaved. They might be drinking a little bit. One of them's lying on the couch. They're spitting, they're cursing, they're laughing. They're acting as humans, and they're facing each other because the tables are tiny. OK, the lobbyists, again, are on the outside because that's where lobbyists are, right? They're in the lobby. The door is shut. The lobbyists are trying to look through the keyhole, look under the door, try and figure out what's going on because they can't influence things unless they know what these guys are doing. And they spoke about this. So big members of the Ways and Means, so another committee that was closed late. So even though they were told to open in the early 70s, they didn't close their committees until late 1975. So the Ways and Means and the conference committees on that resisted as much as they could. And they said specifically to keep out loopholes, to avoid the powers of special interests, right? And so they fought that really hard. And it wasn't until there was a sex scandal with, I forget the name of the guy, who was the chairman of the committee, that he was ousted, and then they got the committees open. As soon as they opened those committees, so there's Ways and Means, there's the people who write the taxes and protect the tax laws. As soon as they opened the committees, and keep in mind, late 1975 is under Carter, not Reagan, the tax rates on the wealthiest Americans plummets. So in 3 years, it goes from 74% to 46%. It's basically been flat ever since. Okay. There is no other good suggestion for why this happened.
It's very interesting how, because it goes against common thought, like that all the way up till this change in congressional voting secrecy. It making it transparent. Things had been getting progressively better for people and more equal.
Right.
Just so,
right. Progressively, yeah, for 40 years, pretty clearly. Inequality reached a peak certainly by 1890, which interestingly, we introduced the secret ballot in 1890. So it was another big transparency problem in 1890. So if you look at the division of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era, everyone says 1890. And mostly they can't tell you why. Why do we all of a sudden start writing progressive laws? We just decided to be better people. And also big corporations can no longer pick representatives, right? And so this takes the introduction of the secret ballot is just accepted by everybody as a staple for democracy, but no one talks about it changing inequality for decades, right? But we start electing representatives that we want for the first time in American history. And so in 1888, the Kansas City newspaper said, well, only 8 people were killed on election day this year. So speaking of intimidation, that's a pretty big thing, right? And you could sell your vote in 1888, not in adjusted dollars, for $25. One vote. So everyone's talking about, oh, wow, people used to show up to vote. Yeah, some districts you would vote, it would be 110% turnout for the vote. You'd be like, $25, I'm going to go home and shave and come back and vote.
And that's like, is that hundreds of dollars now? That's the equivalent of hundreds of dollars?
Probably it's gotta be.
Yeah.
It might even be closer to 400 or 1,000. I don't even know.
Okay.
All right. So, and obviously those are on the last votes, right? When the elections were tight, and Tammany Hall famously switched the presidential election from New York by buying and intimidating votes. Now, what happens to Tammany Hall when you introduce the secret ballot? Well, they kind of start to disappear, right? And 15, 20 years later, they're gone, right? These people are gone. And we start to see, you have a lot of incumbency advantage, so you don't get the massive changes right away. But next 15, 20 years, the progressive legislation is strong and inequality starts to plummet. And so, again, we have these 2 moments of transparency issues, 1970 and 1890. And in between there, we see what you were mentioning. Massive decrease in incarceration, massive decrease in inequality, no issues with the debt, partisanships dropping. I don't think there's a single issue that people can mention that's getting progressively worse. If you're talking civil rights, we're progressively getting better. Are we great? No. People mentioned Vietnam War. That was mostly an executive decision. Congress was pretty thin and weak about that. I have a hard time probably with that issue more than any other, but mostly I haven't done the homework on it to really figure it out. And usually when I do the homework, I find these secrecy issues. But on most things, environment stuff, we're tackling environment. So I think it's really important because you mentioned what's the difference. Now let's talk about the difference between the closed door sessions, these committee sessions, and the open one. I mentioned that these guys are, got their sleeves rolled up and they're drinking and they're talking. But I think the real important difference is walking into the door. So a member of Congress is walking into the door. And in 1969, the lobbyist is sitting outside and he's going, hey, you're about to go into that closed door session. Could you please just think about that stuff that I proposed to you? Please try and do us a solid, man. Awesome work you're doing. We love you and the work you're doing in your district. Just take a look. I think it's convincing, right? And the member of Congress would go in and be like, oh, yeah, Dave, thanks. Thanks for bringing that up again. Really cool. And then they'd shut the door. And then they'd come out and the lobbyists would go, how are we doing there? And the member of Congress could say something like, well, I fought like a tiger in there for you. But the other guys, man, they slaughtered me. I'm sorry. Yeah. Better luck next time, right? That was the discussion. We have that on record in 1969. In 1971, the discussion goes like this. Member of Congress is going to walk in. The lobbyist, who could also follow him in, might just stand in the hallway and go, we're watching you.
Yeah.
That's the whole discussion.
Big difference. Yeah.
You don't ask for a favor anymore. You don't need a solid, right? You are there watching and you're going to oversee their actions. And And so that's the difference. Lobbyists are obviously now inside every committee room. They're the main attendees of all committees. A lot of lobbyists don't need to show up to hearings. So I was at a number of markup sessions last fall, and there's no one in there, but they're all watching on C-SPAN, eating their breakfast at home. And the lobbyists will say, hey, that saved half my time used to be spent going to those committees. Now I can eat breakfast with my kids and watch it at home, and then I can get the actual votes from the committees.
Now, see, it all makes sense to me, the benefits of a secret vote. But because it removes pressure from special interests, but of course, like we're saying, it also removes pressure from really anybody that could track the votes, including regular citizens. So that's like, and I like being able to see what's going on, on C-SPAN, what goes on in these meetings and hearings and votes. I like to see that. And I think it's for most people now, it's unsettling to think that this, unsettling when things are happening behind closed doors. But I guess my question is, isn't it a problem that, yes, even though they wouldn't be as accountable to special interests, wouldn't they also not be as accountable to regular voters? Well,
that's obviously the number one question, right? That people will give you right away. They go, "Oh, how can we hold our members accountable?"
Yeah.
And what's interesting is I love to just sort of play with people because the data on this, which I'll give you in a second, is shocking. But I go, oh, so you follow your members' votes. Can you tell me anything about some of the votes you followed? And they always turn pale, right? They never followed any votes of their members. I'm like, and the most common vote that I hear is they go, oh, we would have never known that Obama had voted against the war. It's the most common one I hear. And I go, but Obama as a local senator out of Illinois couldn't have voted against the war, right? And they go, oh, right. That wasn't a vote. No. So the most common vote I hear isn't a vote, right? So the data on this is just beyond even close to questioning. I had members of, I believe it was represent.us come up to me like 4 years ago, and they were furious at me, right? And I was like, oh, you guys, you follow congressional votes. And they're like, yeah, we follow them. I'm like, how many times a year did your member vote on record last year? And they look at each other, 3 of them. They go, 12. And I go, no, a little bit higher. And these are people calling for more transparency. These are active citizens. These are people who follow government. And they talk, and one guy goes, oh, you're stupid saying 12. It's more like 60. And I go, no, it's a little bit higher. And what? It can't be higher than that. I was like, try 1,000. And likely more like 4,000, because all committee votes don't get put online. All right, the only votes that get put online are committee of the whole votes and floor votes, which is a small percentage actually of the votes. And that amounts to about 800, 900 a year. And so these are very active citizens telling me they're following votes. And it's just absolutely clear they don't even know anything about the voting of members of Congress. This is confirmed by every study we've ever seen. Citizens absolutely do not follow congressional votes, and certainly don't follow
congressional votes. Okay,
right, right, which is what we're talking about.
What you're advocating for, just making those votes secret,
correct.
Not floor votes.
Well, floor votes are included in congressional votes, but they're a small percentage, right? So floor votes are the final votes on legislation. So that's that amounts to about 80 to 100 votes per year.
Okay.
Then the committee votes, which were opened in 1970. So floor votes have always been open, and we don't really fight floor votes. We're happy that they're open because, again, a citizen who might want to really follow their legislator, a really active citizen might follow 20 votes a year, and we'd basically be saying, well, we'll give you 100 a year, right? Let's leave the floor votes open. So if you saw the Lincoln movie, as you mentioned before, that's all about a floor vote, a final vote, okay? And you could see the corruption in that. That's a historical study, and there's a lot of corruption based on it being open. We're still going to be like, okay, we'll leave that open, even though those tend to be corrupt. If you look at Medicaid Part D, that's a floor vote, final vote. very corrupt circumstances involved. Leave those open. Allow members to hide in committees where no citizens are following those votes at all. And again, they're in the thousands.
So yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, so people understand what goes on in regular congressional committee votes versus the floor votes. Like what is the difference of these votes that you're advocating for specifically?
So floor votes are basically called final passage votes, and it's always on what should be the final piece of legislation. So Obamacare, right? I'm going to vote yes or no on Obamacare. Well, that's something that's
Iraq War, is that
right? Yeah. So many
big final votes. Okay.
And I don't think I've ever met a single citizen who read that bill on the Iraq War, by the way, which is 12 pages long, that they said Hillary voted for the war. I think it's tough to say that Hillary voted for the war if you actually read those 12 pages, which is a small bill. That's just relatively small. But people go, "Oh, Hillary voted for the war." She knew that she would have a hard time arguing that she didn't.
Sure. I mean, wasn't it? Yeah,
if you look at that legislation, the legislation offered sanctions, offered all kinds of limitations.
Didn't it basically give the Bush administration the power to go to war? Is that accurate?
Hard to read that into that, though. I mean, again, I haven't gone through that with a fine-tooth comb, but read that 12 pages and go, she voted on the war. That's a tough statement to make. And maybe she should have fought it a bit more. But keep in mind that there's two dynamics going on here, right? All the legislators who are writing this legislation know that they don't want it to be worded so it looks like they're voting for the war. So there's some of that.
Sure.
But there were also some very cautious measures put in to not give the executive branch too much power. And I would say that's the number one influence on that piece of legislation. Let me just grab my charger because it's my computer complaining about battery. So even very obvious votes, which is, we're talking a floor vote that Hillary made on the war. So nothing could be more important and more salient. Yes. And the bill is only 12 pages, which makes it a very rare occurrence, right? And this is a vote that people might talk about. This is one of thousands. And keep in mind, lobbyists, they don't really follow that. They're like, okay, the war stuff, all the public's involved in that.
Well, just so I'm clear, this vote, whether it overtly said we're going to invade Iraq, it enabled that. That's not a controversy. And was that Iraq war vote? Was that Iraq war vote? Was it a floor vote that
Correct.
Okay, so Correct. It was a floor vote. You are not advocating.
I'm not even fighting
making for that kind of thing secret. That should be open. Okay.
No change on that.
Okay.
Again, that's part of the 80 votes a year that are typically open that citizens may or may not follow. We basically know they don't. Most citizens can't even name their members of Congress. Most, but it's certainly near 50%. And I would say the vast majority, we're talking upwards of 95%, don't follow more than one or two votes.
And so the majority of votes, what are these about? I know you mentioned about some torpedo amendments. What are all these votes? Is it all?
Well, first of all, for the most part, we don't know. Right. So legislation can be written in so many ways that it can be confusing. And that's one of the big intentions of lobbyists. Right. They want to try and get their amendment in a way that can't be understood even by the people who are voting on it. Mm-hmm. Right. And if they have the ability to monitor the legislators and make sure that these amendments get in. So if you look at the work by Jack Abramoff, right, he said our biggest moments.
Notorious lobbyist. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Our biggest moments of genius were when we wrote legislation that was so opaque and so complex and so confusing that the legislators themselves didn't understand it and then push that through, knowing legally that's going to help the people they're serving, right? That's the sort of thing that absolutely doesn't exist. So again, starting in 1970, we see the complexity of legislation grow. We see the length of pages grow. Look at the Bill of Rights. That was all written in secret. You've got 10 amendments to the Constitution ratified, all that fit on one page. Now you've got, even, goofy legislation that no one understands, so complex you can't read it. The tax code blowing up to 14,000 pages. Complexity almost never helps the citizen.
Yeah, right? I agree. So explain. This is interesting. Explain how transparency in Congress since 1970. How has that made bills more complex?
Okay, so say you're voting secretly on legislation that I'm writing, and I hand you 1,000 pages. You're going to read it? You're going to be like, look, give me a break. I'm voting secretly. I'll be like, no, this is garbage, right? If you're voting secretly on legislation I'm proposing, I'm going to write it as short and cleanly as possible. I'm going to come and talk to you about the benefits of it, right? I'm going to make it very clear and hope that I can convince you. So it has to be super clear. Remember, legislators aren't much more intelligent than we are, or even if they are, I'm not sure, right? I suspect their IQ is probably higher than average, but they're not geniuses, right? And they're pressured for time. People are constantly handing them amendments. It's kind of like people always handing you demo tapes if you're a musician, right? You just don't have time to go through it all. So it needs to be so short, and it needs to be super clear. Well, if I don't need you to read it, because now I can watch you vote and pressure how you vote, then I can write it as long as I want. And I can write it as badly as I want. And as Oscar Wilde said, sorry for the length of this letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. So you can get lazier. But even more, you can incorporate more interests and more loopholes and more special things, right? And more complexity. And so, yeah, once it's open, complexity just soars. And so there is only one omnibus piece of legislation before 1970, and that's in 1953, and it's only a couple hundred pages long. There's only one. Starting as soon as they open it, omnibus legislation becomes the norm. Everything's done by omnibus now, right? So complexity and length become the way. And again, I would argue that almost all complexity benefits somebody, but not the people.
Yeah. And it just occurred to me, like, with it transparent, actually reading the bill becomes less important. The legislation is less important because it's all about because
you know how you're going to vote before you get handed the text.
Yeah, because of the pressure. Yeah,
right. And so again, if you look
in Congress, they openly admit they don't even read these full bills. It's amazing.
I mean, how can it, honestly, like I've had the 2014 omnibus bill for the budget on my desktop for the last 5 years. Try and read that.
Yeah.
I've had it for 5 years. They were given a few weeks. All right. This is not Gone with the Wind, right? Which is 1,000 pages, right? This is really complex legislation. And the legislation's almost always referring to millions of other pages of legislation and hearings. I mean, it's almost like a table of contents to all the committees. So you think, oh, well, it's only 1,000 pages. I'll get through it. That 1,000 pages is referring to millions of pages. And it should be hyperlinked, but even then, so you've got scholars like Amitai Etzioni who argues, these citizens, they're going to follow legislation. He argues that it's impossible to follow legislation. I would argue the same. I would say that all of Google, all their employees working together to figure out what's going on in one omnibus bill might take 20 years. Right? It's that complex. It's that harried, and a lot of it's written intentionally to deceive.
Yeah,
so it's code, crazy. Right? Read the Bill of Rights. You don't see much code there, right? Yeah. It's like ding, 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 right? And that's how legislation used to be written.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. So not only would a cardboard box in Congress, a cardboard box solution, reduce the influence and power of money over politicians, it would also make bills less complex and reduce and fix that giant problem as well.
Right. And remember, before 1970, it wasn't fully secret. So you would still be open in committees. And they were running into troubles with those open committees. And they thought by further opening them, they would make it better. We argued just the opposite. To correct the problems of the committees they had before 1970. Remember, so if you're the committee chair and there's 11 people, you could see how those members voted. And we believe that was the source of much of the pre-1970 corruption as well. And we suggest making the secret ballots in committee to allow members to actually vote their conscience inside committee. And we believe that would that we'd see a even much more significant decrease in complexity and length of bills than we saw even in the early 1970s or late 60s. And I think it satisfies what they were trying to do or looking to do by opening the committees even better than what they expected.
Let me ask you, like, what are your thoughts on the common solutions people propose to the problem of money in politics, like democracy dollars, giving everybody, a stipend to spend like $200 on their preferred candidate?
Right, right. So yeah, it's a compelling narrative, right? We're going to give them this money and they can spend it. It assumes that these members are taking bribes and are venal and are desperate for more cash, right? So again, if we assume something, we need to have evidence that supports it, right? It doesn't, by giving people all this money, you don't cure at all the negative ads and the dark money, right? So if I take out a negative ad about you showing you sleeping with a puppy, right? No amount of positive money is going to clean that up. Okay. And that's obviously an extreme case, but you can understand where I'm going with that.
You can fight back with ads.
Oh, you can fight back, but boy, that's a tough thing to fight back. You might have to spend 10 times as much. So I might run $100,000 to put that ad up. You might need to spend 20 million to close that down. Again, the negative ad,
that's the kind of thing that increases spending in politics. Yeah.
Well, of course, but again, it assumes that they're venal, that they're accepting bribes, and the evidence is just not there, right? So yeah, we've caught a handful of members who've accepted money throughout history in Congress. Again, the secret ballot stops that too, right? So even the little bit that exists, the secret ballot stops that. But it certainly eliminates all the intimidation, which is the number one playbook of the pharmaceutical company, of Saudi Arabia, of NRA, of AIPAC, you name it, right? If I was going to lobby Congress, I would play by their playbooks. They're very successful and they're very cheap, right? They do this stuff on the cheap. They're not dumb. And so by giving citizens a ton of money, yeah, I see a lot of complexity with that. I see a lot of issues with that. Or we could just make the vote secret. And, so what's interesting is you mentioned how do I view other reforms? I basically put most citizen-based reforms into one bucket, which is the people in Congress are terrible, they're crooks, they need to be replaced. So if we talk about gerrymandering reform, right, we're basically saying one thing: the people in Congress are wrong, we need to get them replaced. We need the right people in there based on our district, et cetera. I've got no problems with fixing gerrymandering, but it's basically that narrative. The term limits reforms, all of those things are basically the people in Congress need to be replaced. Our data suggests that if we close the doors tomorrow, we're going to get good legislation with the people we have. Demographically, they're way better than the all-white groups of 1970s that were lowering inequality day in and day out, that were lowering incarceration rates day in, day out, that were protecting the environment day in, day out, and were resisting corporations day in, day out. I suspect, and I say this often, so it's kind of funny, I suspect that members of Congress are just like, I'm from Boston, right? We're supposedly super liberal, but people in Boston, we don't love the poor. We do nothing to help the poor. We just hate the motherfucking rich, right? Yes. And if you look at legislation pre-1970s, that's what you see by the members of Congress, right there. And the rich are doing fine. I don't think any of the rich were going, oh, I'm not rich enough at the time. But they were really going after them well. And the citizens at the bottom were being well protected.
Yeah, and that brings up a good point. It's like naturally, like it's natural. Like these congressmen and women, they're human. They will not respond positively to these kind of negative attack ads and intimidation if they have a way around it with the secret ballot.
Oh my God. No one's going to attack. If you have a secret ballot, no one's going to attack you. Think of how stupid you would be to attack people who are voting secretly.
Yes.
Right. Where are the attack ads on members of Congress before 1970? Look hard. Right. Again, remember that lobbyist. He's sitting there going, hey, man, hey, buddy, please. right?
Yes.
Oh, okay, nice try in there. Thanks. And then literally when they open it, we're watching you and we're going to take you out. You don't attack a member of Congress. Everything about group theory goes, oh, all the members of Congress see one member being attacked. Bye-bye to that attacking aggressive asshole, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, attack ads disappear, right? The last thing you'd want to do is attack a member of Congress. And I don't care which member of Congress you were, right or left. Walk into a small town and go get your hair cut in 1969. Kids are going to run up to you for your signature, right? Now you're afraid because someone might spit in your face. Okay, think about it. And that's a result from all this negative ads that have gone. All we get is negative commentary about that. So, yeah, I think it's important to realize that it doesn't just give them a way around intimidation. It eliminates it.
Yes. So, James D'Angelo, thanks so much for joining me with your new or actually old idea that is newly remembered, thanks to you, of eliminating money or solving the problem of money in politics and the ridiculous complexity of bills that we're facing.
Thanks. Let's keep the conversation going. I love your work. I'm going to be following it much more in the future. Again, I think your thing on UBI was the best I've seen.
Thanks.
And I think the stuff on Israel is very important. I think you should maybe mention that it's a playbook everybody uses because
yes. Well, that's why I made this video. That's why I wanted to talk to you.
Okay. The Israelis tend to be very sensitive about being, selected individually, right? Yeah. So Saudi Arabia and all that, but and they're very dangerous if you select them individually. And I don't care if you're in academia or in politics, they come after you.
Yeah, I hope. We're having a little changing moment with that, but yeah, historically,
not a chance right now.
No. Well, but with so many, all these, it's harder to crack down on like a million people on the internet than a few networks.
Ostensibly. Laws still have to get passed. I mean, look at the numbers for gun control. 90% of Americans are in favor of stronger gun legislation. 80% with, people have guns in the house. We're getting nowhere with that.
Yeah, you're right.
I don't think we've reached anywhere near those kinds of numbers when we're talking about AIPAC, because most people don't even get who they are.
Yeah, it's true. It's true. Yeah, even a lot of the people comment on the video.
Every legislator gets who they are, and every legislator shits a brick when they walk into the room and start talking. Yeah. And so that's what I'm saying. You can work. You can think that the community's going to do its job, but why not just rely on legislators who are really feeling, I spoke to one legislator who said, when we vote openly, you can hear every sphincter in the room close. I'm assuming that sphincter closing is probably a sense of scared.
On that note, please hit the like button, leave a comment. Thanks for watching.
Matt Orfalea, I guess that's how you pronounce it.
YouTuber Matt Orfalea.
A YouTuber named Matt Orfalea.
Wow, somebody knows me.
Absolutely, baby. We watch your videos. We make them go viral.
People were enjoying it.
All right, let's walk out here.